Well, I'm somewhere different today. This week, Karl Pope, as in Karl Pope Woodcraft's YouTube channel, has taught me how to do dovetail joinery and finally sharpen some chisels. So keep on watching if you want to see how we get on. So firstly, an introduction. Not only is Karl a carpenter on YouTube, he also teaches beginner woodworking classes at his workshop in Hull, Yorkshire, and he's not that far from me. So I asked if he wouldn't mind teaching me how to do dovetail joinery. Now it's a good idea to do this with sharp chisels, and with that first lesson I had, you can watch it already on Karl's channel. I'll leave a link in the description. That's quite satisfying,
isn't it?
But here, let's get right into the dovetail joinery. Also, as this is a lesson, this easily could have been a really long video. So that's why I've decided to share an ad-free, less edited version for my patrons and YouTube members. And you'll instantly get access to all my plans and other exclusive content. With our oak, we're checking for square along one of the cross-cut edges and face with a Carpenter square. He did stress not a combination square, because if you notice they can wobble a bit. And marked with an F on the face running down to the edge of the wood, and an arrow on the narrow edge facing upwards towards the F. And we'll use that for reference as we go. To set up our marking gauges, we're copying the thickness of the wood, but with a slight overhang, about 1/2 mm, and this gives us a safety buffer that we can plane down later. Now to enhance the marks, by going over it with a pencil, and Karl stressed it's important to have the face edging facing you while you're working on it. We clamped it roughly square and set a combination square to 5 mm to start working on the tails and mark from either side. Then place the marking knife on the pencil, push the square up to it so you know you get it right every time, and score all the way across. But go light first, too heavy and you can accidentally slip. And repeat on the other side.
This, what you're doing now, this line here is critical, having that perfectly square.
Next, I set a combination square to roughly centre, marks from either side, then I could make a middle mark that I knew was the actual centre, and 2.5 mm from either side of the centre point, then to score those two new lines. Although, make sure you avoid drawing thick pencil lines. I have a terrible habit of doing that and not sharpening my pencil enough. I was told it's not as critical for this, but it will be for the next one when we trace around the first cuts. That's how thin this should look, not my poor example. Then I could mark on both sides where the lines needed to come down and start setting our sliding bevel to the correct angles. Karl recommends a 1:6 ratio. That's a 6-inch straight line met with another line that's 1 inch away. Then hold your sliding bevel up to it and copy and tighten it. Now we can transfer those marks along our starting lines.
Keep that square against the top and then pull it down.
By the way, I have to say that Karl is a really patient teacher, especially as I have a lot of questions when I'm learning something new. So if you want to take one of his classes, I will leave links below. It's also a good idea to scribble on the sections that you'll be removing in case you do get mixed up. Now for the fun part, using a dovetail saw made of good old Sheffield steel. And Karl said to start the dovetail square right down the middle of the line. I also learnt the technique of digging my thumbnail in the knife groove, but ladies, you can't be precious because they will disappear a bit. And after getting it straight initially, we could then start working on an angle and make sure you don't go over your gauge line. Another tip that I learned is always start your saw at the front and then lower it down. Also try to do the same angles first, then flip it over in the vise so your wrist is consistently the same angle every time. Okay, so it's now time to remove the bulk of the wood, starting with a fret saw and trying to let the saw do all of the work. He recommended to get 2/3 of the way down before angling it, and obviously careful not to cut into your tails. Although mine did get stuck. I was warned it'd snap. I just didn't think it'd be that easy.
Yeah. Oh. I have to buy them in bulk because the students snap them all the time. No, everybody does it.
I thought there'll be a bleep.
Everybody who does it snaps them.
For the sides, we're sawing 1 mm off on the inside, and all the while avoiding cutting on the line. Then we could sneak up to it with a chisel, holding it like a pencil, and careful not to cut yourself.
So to remove this middle section, all we're going to do is just make sure that we've gone all the way down, you know, of our saw marks, and then we're going to sneak up to that line again. And I'm just going halfway down, yeah?
Okay.
And what I do on this one is I purposely tilt slightly forward on the top of the chisel, so I'm doing a bit of an undercut. because if there's like a little mound in the middle when I put my dovetail together, it'll push it apart. Yeah, just clearing everything out now and just making sure it's nice and flat and, you know, across the bottom.
Then to check with a square, see if there's any raised bits, and you'll need to remove them. Before tracing around them, we're enhancing the line by taking out a tiny notch above the line so we can feel it as a reference when we offer up the other piece. I've got the other piece on top and I can feel the groove while it's sat against the other in the vise, and made sure the side was flat using the flat part of a chisel. And the trick is to keep that all steady while tracing around the first cuts with my marking knife. Next I use a square, mark square down to the gauge line, and now hand sawing on the inside of the lines. And Carl said I was tilting, so I definitely don't quite have the knack for hand sawing on an angle yet. So Carl suggested tilting my wrist to correct my wonky angle. And achy muscles do come part of this job.
Oh, Peter doing a Pete Townsend.
Then I could fit the fret saw in again to remove the bulk and repeat chiselling. But this time I had to be so much more careful because I'm chiselling angled pieces. And I suppose the most time consuming part here for beginners like me is offering up the joins, checking for high spots, seeing what's pushing, binding, nipping, chiselling a bit more, and repeat.
Right, brilliant, that. First go.
Next, gluing it up. Carl clamped it for me and we left it to dry while we filmed other things. Now remember us leaving a 0.5 millimeter overhang? We're now removing it with a block plane while it's clamped in the vise. And go over it with some of Carl's boiled linseed oil. And it really brought out the contrasting grains. Apparently this wasn't bad as my first attempt. I just need some ideas on how I can use this on my next project.
Very good.